With us this morning is Tim McSorley. He's the national coordinator. He's from the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. Tim?
Great. Thanks a lot, Greg.
Welcome.
Thanks so much. Good to be here. Maybe I'll just... Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here this morning. It's great to be with you on a Sunday morning, and hopefully, there's a lot I wanted to cover in this presentation. Hopefully it's not too much for early on a Sunday and everyone has their coffee, but it's really great to be here. So as Greg said, my name is Tim McSorley. I'm the national coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. Maybe I'll, did it go to, okay, this is a problem. It went to sleep, so I have to keep moving so it doesn't go to sleep on us. This morning I wanted to talk with you about some of the work that we've been doing around what's now the Strong Borders Acts. There was one before, there's two now, and I'll get into why that is and what it means for us. But it's been an important part of our work over the last 6 months since the Carney government introduced it as its first bill. And it presents a lot of challenges and concerns that I think will affect many of us in the room here today and many people across Canada in all kinds of different ways. And I'll get into some of the details and why we've been working to oppose the bill and maybe some ways that hopefully share what those are, explain a little bit, and share some of the ways that you can be involved and see how we can work together on it. But first, I just want to take a step back and explain a little bit about the work that we do at the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group and where we're coming from on this issue. So the ICLMG is a coalition, actually, of 45 organizations, Canadian civil society groups, from across the country, including the CCU. The CCU has been one of our strongest and best supporters over the lifetime of our coalition that started in 2002. And we came together then just after Canada adopted the first anti-terrorism act of this country ever in this country's history in 2001. And the reason we came together at that point was because people could see that in the midst of the horrible attacks of 9/11, but in the government's response to that through new security legislation that included attacks on privacy, undermining due process in the courts, bring in new laws that were targeting especially the Muslim community in Canada at the time, but that had wide-ranging impacts for migrants and refugees coming to Canada, the strengthening of border controls that were restricting people being able to travel for work or to see family. And then eventually over the years, the several years after that we saw Canadians being rendition to torture in other countries, Canada participating in illegal wars. And so this coalition came together because no one at the time was looking specifically at the impact of these anti-terrorism laws. And no one of those groups, including international humanitarian organizations, labor organizations, faith-based groups, had the resources at the time either to be dedicated staff to be looking at this full time. And so they came together and formed this coalition. And since then, we've been working to defend civil liberties and human rights in Canada from the impact of anti-terrorism laws. And that includes things from increases of police surveillance, monitoring of digital communications, crackdowns at the border, ways that it can increase xenophobia and racism in our country by targeting certain communities without evidence. As well as the broader impacts on civil society organizations. So the impact on freedom of expression, the attacks on the ability to protest, including impacts of the use of these tools. Not just, they don't stay relegated to just counterterrorism, but they're used in all kinds of ways. So we've seen how the tools brought in post 9/11 have been used to crack down on environmental protests, have been used to spy on labor organizing, on student unions, and things like that. And so we try to take a very broad approach to this, but looking specifically at these anti-terrorism and national security powers. So you can find out more about our work by going to ICLMG.ca. And on our site, you can also sign up for our news digest. We send it out every 2 weeks. It has updates about our own work, but also includes articles and updates about these issues in general, both in Canada and internationally. So maybe to get to the topic I wanted to get into today and to talk about why we're so concerned about the Strong Borders Act that came in, it's known as Bill C-2, that came in June 2025. And to do that, I want to give a little bit of context of why we're so worried about, because it isn't just about a single piece of legislation, but it's about how Canada has been responding over the past year and even longer before that to the Trump administration, to the threats of tariffs and economic insecurity that it's causing, but in ways that are having fundamental and really critical impacts on the rights of people here in Canada. And so what we saw back in late 2024 when Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister and under the former Liberal government, that as soon as Trump came in with the threats of tariffs and claiming without any basis in evidence that Canada was an entry point for mass amounts of fentanyl and illegal drugs and of human trafficking and of national security threats and so-called illegal immigrants, that the government reacted very strongly and in a very kind of reactionary way at the time by immediately saying we're going to put $1.3 billion into new surveillance tools, into new police at the borders, strike up these joint task force to share more information with the United States, all while even internal government reports and public research were showing that the threat that Trump was putting forward to justify these tariffs was non-existent. That the amount of drugs flowing, and especially fentanyl, into the United States, while concerning, was incredibly minimal and didn't necessitate this kind of reaction. That stats coming out of the United States of so-called terrorists apprehended at the border were simply cases where US border agents had suspicions about somebody and turned them away. And based on their suspicions, without any evidence or documentation that they could be a national security threat, and we know that through what the US has defined national security threat, that involves basically people from countries that they don't like or that they don't suspect, and they don't need any more than that, that they were using these numbers to try to justify the claims that we need these economic, these new tariffs. And as we've all seen since then, it's a moving target. Trump has, and the US administration has said all these things, but then once you try to answer with one hand, well, there's another problem that comes up somewhere else. But the issue here in Canada was that the government reacted so quickly to try to appease Trump with this, that they decided to put all this money at a time where we need money and other resources, and to increase security and bring in new surveillance tools and things like that, rather than actually countering the accusations, which was actually the subject of an internal report from national security agencies to the PMO, saying that the better approach would be to counter this idea of a crisis rather than simply go along with it. Following that, we had the election. We had a new prime minister who was running, saying that it was elbows up and pushing back against Trump. And that signaled maybe a shift in the dynamic, a shift in what we would see happening next. But then very quickly after the election, what we saw was a return to that same kind of reaction. And that came in with the adoption the introduction of the new government's very first bill last June, called Bill C2 and known as the Strong Borders Act. And so that bill came in, and it was a complete surprise. We heard that Cabinet was given 48 hours to review it. Most people, even in the Cabinet, didn't know this bill was coming, and that it brought in significant new changes to current legislation, bringing in new laws that would have wide-ranging impacts on everything from searching of mail to the Coast Guard to money laundering and terrorist financing laws, but also to asylum, refugee rights, immigration rights, as well as new tools for the police that raise significant concerns around privacy and surveillance. So these are just some of the headlines from around that time when the bill was brought in, and kind of demonstrates some of the concerns that came up. So just really briefly around what are bills C2 and C12. And so I'll be talking about both bills. And the reason for that, part of it is because of the success that we've had so far pushing back against Bill C2. So when Bill C2 came out, there was an immediate reaction to many parts of the bill. And so the government, and I'll go into this in more detail later, decided just recently in October to introduce a whole new bill called Bill C12 that basically takes parts of C2, puts them in another bill, word for word, that they want to fast track. And I'll go into a little bit more about why they want to fast track that part, while the other parts of C2 that aren't in the new bill are still going to continue through Parliament, maybe a little bit slower. So it's a reaction from the government to criticisms of the bill, but I'm still going to deal with both of them together today because in the end, it's all still the same package. Nothing has changed. the proposed amendments and proposed new laws and new police powers all stay the same. It's just in two different bills now instead of in one. And so a coalition that's come together to push back against the first bill is still continuing its push, but now just looking at both bills together. I know it's a little, even we've had a little trouble in the last kind of 2 weeks since this new bill came in to kind of wrap our brains around what the government is doing with this. But essentially, it's still one part of the same strong borders package, if we can call it, as we start kind of calling it. You see the second bill is called the Strengthening Canada's Immigration System and Borders Act. So it's always about stronger and strengthening, even though, it might bring, that's on a security side, but what it does is essentially weaken a lot of the human rights and civil liberties protections that, we and Canadians and others have fought so far hard for. What we saw in the first bill and continues in these two bills is that it's bringing in a major expansion of state surveillance powers, especially in their ability to access the personal and private information of not just anyone in Canada, but for Canadian law enforcement and intelligence agencies to access information about anyone that's held in Canada. So, if Canadian companies are working internationally and hold information about people outside of Canada within Canada, then Canadian agencies would be able to access those as well, not just about ourselves, but about any information within the country. But it also grants Canadian law enforcement powers to more easily access information held internationally about us. So even information that isn't held within Canada, they would now be able to go out and seek that information from foreign entities and foreign companies. So for example, the biggest example is Google, where if their servers are in the United States, it makes it easier for Canadian law enforcement to access that information, which on one hand, maybe makes sense because if information is traveling internationally, then police, if they have a lawful reason to access that information, they should be able to go get it regardless of where it is. But I'll get into some of the problems, and a big part of that is that in doing so, they're lowering the threshold for them to be able to ask for this information. So it's not just about getting the information, it's about making it a lot easier to access our personal information in ways that go against the Charter and go against the rulings of the Supreme Court. Along with that, it introduces reciprocal powers so that foreign entities, foreign law enforcement agencies, will also have an easier time to request information that's held within Canada. And so that, of course, raises concerns about which foreign countries, which law enforcement agencies will be able to access that information. A lot of it is based around our relationship with the United States. And of course, seeing what's happening in the United States right now, we just saw the No Kings protests. They're saying 7 million people in the streets yesterday against the attack in the United States on basic civil liberties and human rights. And so one of the main concerns we have with this right now is that we shouldn't be building a closer relationship with a government that we're seeing is engaging in such rights violations and really undermining their own citizens' rights, but also setting an example and laying the groundwork for that to happen in other countries like Canada as well. And then beyond the privacy and surveillance issues, there's this fundamental attack on the rights of asylum seekers and migrants coming to Canada. And I'll actually get into that in a bit more detail. So Canada is viewed around the world as having, and rightly so, for having a world-class immigration and refugee system. It's come under a lot of criticism over the last 2 years. There are issues that need to be resolved, clearly. But even with those issues, Canada is still viewed as being a world-class example of these kinds of systems, even though on both sides, both in terms of offering protections, but also ensuring it's an efficient system, needs to be addressed. And what the government is bringing in now are new restrictions that are seriously undermining that, and that raise significant human rights concerns. So one of those, and one of the major ones, is they would institute a new 1-year limit on claiming asylum or refugee status in Canada. So what that means is that if somebody comes to Canada and on a work permit or a study permit, let's say for 4 years, now during that time, let's say something changes in their country or changes for themselves personally. There's a coup in their country, it's not safe for them to go back. Maybe family members are part of a community that's now being persecuted. but they've been in Canada for 18 months. The government will say, well, that's too bad. You've been here for over a year. You're not able to go through, make an asylum claim in the usual way. There's other more restrictive ways that they would be able to ask to remain in Canada if their life will be under threat if they were to return to their country, but they wouldn't be able to actually make a formal refugee claim within Canada anymore. And so it's a simply arbitrary 1-year cutoff. Even worse, it doesn't have to be 1 year consecutive within Canada. So let's say somebody came to visit Canada as a child, visited with their parents, came on vacation for whatever reason, and then 20 years later, they're a human rights defender in their country, they're being persecuted, they want to come to Canada to apply for asylum. That 1 year started from that day they came here as a 4-year-old with their family on vacation, and now they would no longer be able to come to Canada and claim asylum. And so it's an arbitrary system that actually makes it worse than the current system in the United States, if you can imagine that, and that the government has said will help ensure the integrity of the asylum system. And certainly there's been cases that we've all seen over the last year of abuses of the asylum system. But this approach of such a broad-based exclusion will only simply lead to people who deserve to have those protections be excluded in Canada, and will also cause a lot more confusion within Canada and can even tie up the system more, because the asylum system is one where you can present your case, where there's a formal channel. Whereas if somebody comes to Canada and can't go through the official asylum process and goes through what they call a pre-removal risk assessment, it can actually drag out even more. And that goes through the courts instead of the asylum system, and so it can tie up judicial resources. So the system that they're proposing, the solution that they're proposing, actually is one that not only will have an impact on fundamental rights, but will also have an impact on our judicial system and our judicial resources, and which is something that legitimately people want to see addressed. The other issue that we see, a major issue in terms of migrant rights and immigrant rights, is that this bill would bring in for the first time powers for the government to either mass suspend or mass cancel immigration documents or immigration applications. So to put that really clearly, if we look at what's happening in the United States right now, where the Trump administration has been saying that, refugees or asylum seekers from Haiti or from Venezuela who are in the country now just en masse because of public interest, and that's the same wording that we see in Canada, this new legislation, just in the public interest, the Trump administration is canceling all those immigration applications, making people statusless, removing their status, and then setting them up for mass deportation. This new legislation, if passed, would bring essentially the same powers to Canada, where the Canadian government and future governments, and that's one of the things that we're concerned about, because one of the responses we've gotten is, well, this current government wouldn't engage in that kind of xenophobic or discretionary or political kind of approach to the immigration system. And maybe they wouldn't. But the way the laws are being framed right now and the broadness of these powers would mean that any future government or any change in the political situation would allow for that to happen. And so we've seen in the past laws brought in Canada that, that were used to engage in the exclusion of people from China, from Southeast Asia, people from the Caribbean, people, and even more recently, people coming from Hungary, and just saying that en masse, we're not accepting your applications anymore. This would codify that into law to be able to say that, well, based on public interest, we are no longer going to accept applications from people coming from X country or under certain kinds of visas. And we think that's much too broad and a much too dangerous a power that can be abused in so many ways. And on top of that, it would also allow for the cancellation of the status of people within Canada, just on this public interest need. And so again, as we've seen in the United States, that people within the states have seen their status canceled, the attack on critics of the government having their student visas rescinded simply because they've criticized the government or engaged in or participated in lawful protest. This legislation brings in would bring in similar powers in Canada. And we just don't think that that's the kind of laws that any government should have, or kind of powers that any government should have, regardless of whether it's this one or future governments. I'm going to move on. There's other things around immigration, but I want to move on so we can cover all aspects of the bill. And so now I want to go in a little bit more on the issues of how the bill will impact privacy and civil liberties in Canada. So some of you may be familiar with the idea of lawful access. It's kind of come back a few times over the last few decades, but it's also kind of, a bit of an esoteric term. So just to say, lawful access is this term that police often use in order to talk about what kind of information they can lawfully access. So what do warrants allow them to access, or what do the powers in law allow them to access? And the problem that we've seen over the last 2 decades have been that police, without real justification or evidence, have been pushing to lower the threshold for a judicial authorization or for what they need to prove in order to access our personal and private information. Some of you may remember this back from the Conservative government under Stephen Harper. At the time, the public safety minister was Vic Taves. They brought in legislation to that's in line, not the same, but in line with what the government is asking for now. And at the time, there was a mass pushback, and the government got so frustrated that they came out with a line that you're either with us or you're with the child pornographers, essentially saying that if you were concerned about the protection of privacy rights, then you must be on that side. This government, thankfully, has been more open to the conversation and haven't framed their critics that way. But it's a similar approach and an attempt to bring in similar laws. At that time, it was framed as needed in order to protect against child sexual exploitation. Today, we're seeing these laws brought in under the guise of saying, well, we need to respond to the Trump tariffs. We need to be able to respond to the threat from the United States, and we need these laws to prove to them that we're serious. But in reality, these are laws that we know that national security and law enforcement agencies have been pushing for a very long time. And so why are these a problem? Because maybe police do need more access, or there might be technological reasons and advances that criminals are using that and this is the argument they use. That means that police need more access. But this is much broader than that. So one of the biggest problems that we see are these new warrantless powers. So they wouldn't have to go to a court. It's based simply on law enforcement's decision that on reasonable grounds to suspect, which is kind of the lowest threshold, they just need to have a suspicion that information that they're looking for could help them with an investigation. So not even that it's that there's a reasonable belief, which is a higher threshold. So it's not that they believe that the information they're looking for is essential to their investigation, but simply that it's that they have a suspicion that the information could be of assistance, which is a very, very low threshold to justify accessing the private information of people. And the Supreme Court has ruled multiple times that they need higher thresholds in order to be able to access that kind of information. But what so these new powers on that low threshold, they're calling them information demands. So for example, a police force, a police officer or a detective would be able to go to any service provider in Canada and say, we want X information on an individual. It's limited in scope in terms of what they can ask, but it's very broad in who they can ask. So often when we talk about lawful access, it's framed as we'll be able to ask, internet service providers or cell phone companies or email providers because somebody might be operating anonymously. And we need to just get an idea of who this anonymous account belongs to or who holds it, and then we can move forward with our investigation. But this law actually says it would apply to any service provider, anybody who provides a service to the public in Canada. So that isn't limited to Rogers or Bell or Videotron or Google. It would include medical professionals, healthcare professionals. It would include legal services, immigration services, banking services, apps that we use. All of those are considered services that are provided to the public. Things that we might not think we're as concerned about, dry cleaning, car rentals, and things like that. But that can present really important, once put together, really crucial information about who we are. So these information demands would allow police to go to, for example, my doctor, or a doctor they suspect of providing services to me, and say, is Tim, and how they would be limited in what they could ask. It's mostly yes or no answers, but they could say, is Tim McSorley, your patient? And they would have to say yes or no. And again, it's just on a reasonable, just on a suspicion that the information they're looking for could be of assistance. Is Tim McSorley a patient? Yes. Over what time period did he access your services? They would have to tell them that. Where did he access your services from? Do you hold any other information about other service providers who have provided him support? So that would include whether or not I've gotten referrals to other medical health practitioners. And so when you think about what kind of picture that could paint to somebody if they went to, for example, a psychiatrist and they would find out that information. What one interesting example that a colleague made was that they could use this for dating apps and they would be able to find out, that's very sensitive information about, are you looking to date? What your sexual orientation is and things like that. You might not be public, and you certainly don't want the police being able to just simply ask, are you using a certain app? It becomes even more complicated when we think about other, medical or legal services people are looking for. What if, you're considering a divorce or you're in a situation of spousal abuse, and you go see a lawyer about that who specifically deals in those issues? Should the police? Should the police, on a simple, very low basis, without any judicial authorization, be able to find out that you've been going to that person for how long, where you've accessed it from, and whether or not they have other information about you? It can be very, very revealing, especially when it's combined maybe with public information that's already out there or other, information that the police may be able to gather about you. And so this is one of the major concerns that we have about the legislation. Beyond that, it also lowers the bar for what's known as production orders. So these are warrants, essentially. It's another name for judicially approved warrants. But again, they would lower the bar so that a judge would only have to decide based on this reasonable grounds to suspect threshold as well, which is, again, the Supreme Court has said is too low a bar. But the government believes that they can make a case, and that if it went to a charter challenge that it would pass. We don't believe that it would. But again, that they would lower this threshold. And with these production orders, because they're judicially approved, they would be able to seek out even more information that service providers hold about us, including account information and other sensitive information about what they hold in their files. And so, taken together, these present a real threat to the protection of privacy and can have a real impact on whether or not people feel comfortable accessing certain services and how that information can be used. It can also have an impact on the service providers. There's very limited powers within the bill for those service providers to challenge a production order. So they have up to 5 days to challenge an order. But if the order demands the information be turned over within a day, they have to do it before that deadline comes up. So in theory, they have up to 5 days. But in reality, if a police officer were to go and say, we want this information within 24 hours, they would only have 24 hours to get everything arranged, figure things out, and go to a court to ask that the order be suspended while it's being challenged in court. Which for a lot of service providers, they wouldn't have that kind of resources. They wouldn't have that kind of expertise and the time. And so they may simply comply. And they may then also be worried about who am I providing services to. They may cut people off and things like that. So there's a lot of broader implications to these new powers that we think pose much too dangerous a threat to the fundamental rights of people in Canada than to justify, then can be justified with the reasons that the government has given. And I think, from our perspective right now, the government and our conversations with the government, they haven't even been able to provide concrete examples of why they need these powers, but rather simply we need them because, criminals are getting more technologically advanced and we need to counter the Trump administration's threats. And this is what they want us to do to show that we're serious. It's a little bit more restrictive in that sense because it has to be related to, I believe it's subscriber information, so a little bit more limited in terms of which service providers would fall under it. But let's say it's a healthcare provider that provides virtual consultations. Then it would still possibly fall under this kind of these kinds of new foreign law enforcement requests. And our concern is that people may travel to Canada to seek out, again, for example, taking the medical care example, to seek out medical care that may be unavailable in their country, may be persecuted in their country. We see in the United States the restrictions on reproductive and sexual rights, sexual health rights. And so if somebody were to travel to Canada to avail themselves of the services here in Canada, these new laws could ease an investigation of them back in their home state for crimes that would not be considered a crime in Canada. And beyond that, Canada is also in the midst of negotiating international information sharing agreements, both bilaterally with the United States, but also a new UN cybercrime treaty that has raised a whole host of other concerns. But one of the issues that we've seen with this is that it's bringing in amendments to align Canadian law with those treaties to make it easier to adopt those treaties once they move forward. And we don't think that we should be modifying our laws in order to adapt and ease the adoption of treaties that haven't actually been debated publicly here in Canada yet, and that raised a lot of other concerns. The other thing that they do, that this bill will do in terms of surveillance and privacy issues, is bring in a new act called the Supporting Authorized Access to Information Act. It sounds very, it's a very vague kind of title, but specifically what it would do is allow the government to both issue public but also secret orders, so that, in this case, electronic service providers, so now we're talking about email providers, internet providers, and things like that, Google, Meta, Facebook, but other smaller ones too, apps that you may use, local ISPs, if people use tech savvy or other small internet service providers, those will be included as well, to modify their systems to ensure that law enforcement and intelligence agencies, so CSIS, the RCMP, the Canadian Border Services Agency, will be able to more easily access their information if they have a warrant or if they have lawful authorization. So lawful authorization could be what's in the law. So as I was saying with these information demands, there's no warrant necessary, but in other cases there would be. But they would be able to tell these service providers, okay, you need to modify how you provide your service to the public to facilitate law enforcement access to that information when they need it. So what that means is that, for example, some service providers may only collect limited information about you in order to maintain the privacy of their clients. Some people may use Signal, which is a communications app that is encrypted, is very private. They only collect limited information about people when you sign up. This bill, arguably, could be used to order them to say, well, you need to be able to collect more information about your clients so that when we have an order to get that information, you have it on hand. Or in other cases, some companies only hold on to that kind of information for 6 months. They don't want to hold on to it forever. There's risks of it being hacked, of it being breached, of it being abused, or simply, other problems coming up. And so as a risk mitigating factor, they may not hold on to it. Orders like this could result in ordering them to hold on to that information for longer, simply so that police would be able to access it if they ever need it. And these orders would be able to be made in secret. So we would never even know, and the companies that are impacted would never be able to tell us that they're actually making these changes. The government has said that there are safeguards built in, and we see that there's some language around safeguards, but they definitely don't go far enough. So for example, they say that in the bill, it says that it wouldn't be allowed to cause a systemic vulnerability. So anything that they ask a company to do wouldn't be able to cause some kind of vulnerability in their system that would put the privacy of individuals at risk. But it's not defined in the bill what systemic vulnerability is or what encryption is, which is used to protect the information. That's going to be done under regulation, and regulations can be changed based on which government is in power. And so our concern is that there's enough space in there and enough broad wording within what they can order these companies to do that it places raises a significant risk of abuse, of leaks, of hacks of our private information. And also in a more general way, these kinds of powers could force companies to set their systems up in a way that would allow for things like real-time mass surveillance of electronic communications. RCMP may need to get a warrant to be able to do that, but there's been a long-standing debate and concern about whether police in general should just be allowed to do that at all. And so what we see with a system like this is that they would be able to force companies to set up their systems in a way to allow that in secret so we would never know. Often warrants to engage in that kind of surveillance are secret as well. And so, it would be very difficult to actually know exactly how these powers are being used and what their impacts could be. And so one of the other things that we've been pushing for, and that isn't in this bill, is that there are no tools or requirements for reporting, for transparency, for accountability. So nothing along, so currently for eavesdropping warrants, for example, the government doesn't need to say what cases are used for, but there are annual reports around certain kinds of warrants that are issued to police or that they request in order to be able to get an idea of why they're asking for these invasive kinds of warrants, how they're being used. Not the specifics, but just in a general way to provide some kind of accountability and oversight. There are no requirements of that type in this legislation, both around the information demands and the production orders or in these new authorized access law. So not only does it bring in all these new powers, there aren't any safeguards being put in place to ensure that we know how they're being used and that they're not being abused. So I'll skip over some of this other stuff because I want to be able to get to questions. I've covered a lot about what this means, but to really break it down, we're concerned about it, the government's move to significantly undermine charter rights, to undermine Canada's international human rights obligations and their human rights obligations domestically, but also this intense focus on security and putting $1.3 billion into security. All these new powers are going to come with the need for more resources and more money for law enforcement. And, a debate can be had about, times when that's necessary. But as I said, these powers are based on arguments that haven't been supported by evidence, that raise a lot of concerns. And at the time when people are struggling to afford healthcare, well, not healthcare because we have accessible healthcare, but afford housing, afford groceries, that we're concerned about access to healthcare and funding going to healthcare, that, should we be looking at focusing on a security-based response, or should we be looking at how can we better support our social services, protect fundamental rights, distinguish ourselves from what's happening in the United States right now? And unfortunately, with this bill and even others that the government has introduced, we're going in the opposite direction. We're going in the wrong direction right now. And so there's been a big pushback, and that's, as I said, why we have two bills now instead of one, even though they're both just as problematic as when they were one bill. Back in the spring, and since then, we've been part of an effort that brought together 300 civil society organizations back in June to speak out and call for the withdrawal of the bill. We ourselves, ICLMG, are part of a small group that are currently leading an organizing network, the Stop Bill C2 organizing network, to coordinate efforts across civil society organizations to push back against this legislation. The splitting of the bill, the reason they split the bill is because we've put a lot of pressure. And that pressure has been picked up in some ways by the opposition parties. So the Conservatives, along with the Bloc Québécois to a certain degree, are very concerned about the surveillance issues and about privacy as it speaks to a portion of their base, but also their general concerns around protection of civil liberties. Unfortunately, they tend to agree with the government quite a bit and even argue they should go forward with the parts of the bill that would undermine refugee and immigrant rights protections. And so they split the bill. And right now it's being framed as Bill C12, the new bill that contains everything except for the surveillance parts, is going to be fast-tracked. They want to push it through Parliament as fast as possible because they know they have the support of at least the Conservatives and possibly others. While they say that Bill C2, will take a closer look at it, it'll go through Parliament maybe a little bit more slowly, but they still intend on passing it. And to us, that's unacceptable. I didn't get into it, but there's also information sharing provisions in the immigration and refugee parts of the bill that don't just that impact primarily refugees and immigrants, but also would cover all of Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, so it also includes all information that we submit for passports, for example. And the bill will broaden the ability for the Immigration Department to be able to share that information across all government departments and with foreign law enforcement agencies as well. So this idea that we can pass one part of the bill quickly and that's fine and take more time to look at the other part of the bill is really problematic. It's to us a divide and conquer approach, saying that, well, we have political support for one part, so we're going to push that through so there's no time to push back on it, and we'll take a little bit more time on the other, but still we want to get it passed. So that's why the coalition of groups, this network of groups, is still continuing to work together. This is just an idea of some of the main kind of players who we've been reaching out to and advocating with around the bill. Some of the public safety critics, some of the party leaders who are really those who are guiding the bill or who are engaged with it in the opposition parties. So we're continuing the push. It's moving through Parliament. Likely Bill C-12 will go to committee relatively soon. But we're still organizing. Groups across the country are organizing webinars, or organizing press conferences, or organizing visits to their MPs' offices. So if you're interested in getting more involved, you can email me and we can add you to the listserv that we have. It's very low traffic, but it's about organizing meetings. Right now we have anywhere between 35 and 45 organizations generally joining these calls on right now every 2 weeks essentially, in order to kind of coordinate our efforts across the country. And there's also, and we'll send this out afterwards, a resources page with more information about Bill C-2. We also have a letter writing campaign on our website here, and again, we'll circulate this so you don't have to write it down, but to write to the government to raise these concerns with them. And that's the end of the presentation, but be very happy. I think we still have more time to kind of take questions and have some discussion about this.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Sorry, coming through. Anybody have a quick question for Tim? Barbara? Mike's coming.
Hi, really interesting presentation. My name is Barb Bachmeyer. I live in the Quesnel area, which is south of Prince George. And I got two things. CFA, they're already there.
Right.
Okay? And that impacts our farmers as well. And they've been doing that, running roughshod forever. So anyway, that's part of what you're talking about here. The other thing is that concerns me is our medical plan. Our medical plan is trying to encourage people to go online and speak with people when they have different problems, okay? And whatever they are. And so if this passes, that information is basically a free-for-all. So that's very concerning, and I'm hoping that our benefit plan, all of our benefit plans, will start pushing back on that, because our trustees are frontline, and we need to discuss that and see if there's some way that we can push back on this, because I don't honestly do that stuff online, but a lot of people need help and they need to go there, and what's the best course of action that we can take as benefit trustees or pension plan trustees? Thank you.
Thanks. No, that's a really good point. And just to mention that, we often speak about, doctor-patient confidentiality or legal privilege with lawyers. One of the things that we see in the legislation is that privilege, the idea of privileged information, is a defense and a reason for a judge to accept a challenge of a production of an information demand or one of the production orders, but it's based on the service provider actually filing the challenge. So it's not a before the fact issue of, well, if there's privilege or sensitive information or confidentiality, then you can't make an information demand. It's only, well, if the police make an information demand, that service provider needs to exert their authority or their legal obligation of privilege, of medical confidentiality. And then on that basis, the order could be rejected by the courts or blocked by the courts, but they need to make that first step rather than the legislation recognizing that maybe a carve-out should be that you can't be using warrantless information demands in order to go to a medical, a healthcare practitioner or to a legal, to somebody providing legal services, to ask for this kind of information. But it really places the onus on the service provider to have to take the action themselves to block it. So that's, I think a big concern.
Will, oh, sorry, no. I have another question, Barbara, from Will Christie.
Oh, okay, sure.
Will Christie.
Thank you, Tim. Will Christie from Winnipeg and AC's representative. Preventative measures are better measures, but do we have a backstop with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Like, don't a lot of these things potentially violate those? And we're trying to avoid having to escalate this up to the Supreme Court for an evaluation?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And so one of the things that we've been raising with the government is that they are opening the door to litigation. That if these laws were to pass, that certainly there will be challenges in the courts to maybe not all of them, but to a large majority of them, and especially these warrantless information demands, and likely around some of the changes to the asylum and immigration laws as well. And so, the government knows this. Even in their charter statement about the bill, they recognize, without saying that, for sure, that it violates a charter, but laid out a whole list of areas of the charter that are implicated by this bill. And certainly the best approach for them would be to change the legislation now or withdraw it, ideally. And that's what we've been calling for, in order to avoid having to go through this costly litigation process that takes up resources from civil society, the government as well, and will only come when somebody challenges it. So it's only once people start to be impacted by these laws that that'll be happening. So it's not just the financial resources, but also the cost of the individuals who will be impacted by it until it takes its time to go through the courts and it's rejected. So yeah, certainly the charter is the real backstop here, and the hope would be that the government would recognize it and not move forward with these pieces of legislation, rather than leave it to Canadians to have to challenge the bill once it's put into place. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions for Tim?
One more question.
One more.
We only have one more question.
We only have time for one more. Hang on, I didn't see your hand, Lorraine.
Just get the mic.
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to
Tell us
ask.
who you are.
Sorry. Oh, Burak Raisian. I'm from Yusapui. I just wanted to ask how the surveillance part of the legislation would interact with Freedom to Access Information Act, because I'm just wondering, if it were to pass, would we have any opportunities to know what information the government has accessed through which provider on which people, and what level of transparency would be provided hypothetically with this?
Thanks. No, that's a very good question. For each of the different parts have different kind of I guess, ways that what's the word I'm looking for? They have confidentiality orders kind of attached to them. So it kind of depends on which power. But if we take the warrantless powers, what it allows is for the police to tell in their information demand order to require that service providers agree to non-disclosure for up to 1 year. So essentially, if they go to a service provider and ask for that, information about, is this person a client, yes or no, what dates or where do they access it to, those kinds of limited but revealing questions, without a warrant, police would be able to tell that service provider, well, you can't share the fact that we've come to you to ask this for up to a year. They could say, well, in some cases, they could say, well, you can tell the person right away. In other cases, so it would be very difficult to know whether, how these powers are being used and whether or not you've been impacted by them. It's also the fact that, police can order the non-disclosure for up to a year. But let's say you don't know that there's even been an order put out to request your information. Ideally, your service provider would tell you, but there's nothing in the legislation that would require them to. So it could be very possible that your service provider receives this request, but because it's only information to assist with an investigation, you may never actually know, unless it proceeds to court or even that you're called to appear in court, that this information was requested, unless your service provider tells you, and they would be restricted from telling you up to 1 year after they receive it. For the production orders that require warrants, at least a judge would be deciding on that, and then the judge would set the time limit for non-disclosure. So maybe there is a good reason to not disclose because it could impact an investigation if we agree that the powers are justified in the first place, and the judge would be able to decide that. But again, there would be the question of, are you informed afterwards? Does it proceed to court and things like that? And so there are no proactive provisions to really answer your question, no proactive provisions in the legislation to require service providers or the police to inform you that you've been a subject of one of these orders or demands, which, to be fair, is generally the case. Unless it's, for example, a wiretap, I believe wiretap and other kinds of communications interceptions, and there's provisions in certain cases for people to be informed at a certain point. But I didn't touch on it a lot, but these powers don't just apply either only to police, but also to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is Canada's national spy agency, and they operate almost entirely in secret. They engage in disruption activities that don't often proceed to court. And so in those cases, you would likely almost never hear about whether or not an orders they've used these powers to collect information about you. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Tim, thank you for coming here today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, Tim.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much.
Oh, here,
And a
put this
gift
down.
from the
Oh,
Confederation
wonderful.
of
Thank
Canadian
you.
Unions for you.
Thanks.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.